What's going on, e-learning AP Human Geography students? It's Mr. Majewski. Week 6 lecture is here. We are into our second week of development. This is kind of a mini unit. We don't cover all of development, but we cover most of it, and then we come back to it later in the year. So we're going to be covering what is technically 2 sets of slides, although we're picking up where we left off with the slides from last week. So we only have a few to hit on, actually, before we move over to the second set of slides here. They are in order under 6.2.1. And then for the second set of slides, there is actually this Google sheet that you will be typing information for, where you're going to describe each of the development models that are covered, and then try to create or write out some sort of visual reminder of that theory to help you better remember it when we go to the exam. So let's start out by going back to the intro to development slides. Now we're sliding all the way down to slide 34. We covered 1 through 33 last week, and so we're going to get right into it so that we can be done faster. Okay. So guys, my question to all of you is, we know what development is and we know how development is measured. So how would we boost development if in a country? Whether we're just a regular citizen or whether we're the leader of a government or a non-government organization, how would you boost development in a country? Well, the answer is you would try to develop projects that will boost one of those indicators, right, in a particular place, since those are the indicators that are used to measure worldwide development. So, for instance, you want to boost, GNP per capita? Well, provide job training programs, right? Provide skills programs. Maybe provide education, workplace education programs, so people are able to take higher level jobs in that area, in that country, in order to boost the development numbers there. You want to boost social development? How about education, right? Improve education, more schools, develop a plan to build a new school or to build more schools. Or to build better access to schools, for instance, transportation. Maybe to build better resources in schools, to develop hiring programs for teachers or for other educational leaders. Not only is that going to boost social development by boosting those education indicators, it's also, if you remember, going to boost GNP per capita, right? Because more education generally means higher skill, higher wage jobs, which is a boost not only to the social development, but also the economic development as well. And then if you want to boost, the demographic indicators, the health indicators, you develop plans to try to maybe build hospitals where they don't exist, or medical facilities. Maybe you develop programs to improve access to medicine. So for instance, a better emergency response system. Maybe you want to make vaccines more widespread. Maybe you want contraceptives to be more widespread, right? To reduce sexually transmitted diseases, for instance. Maybe you develop safety net programs, right? Like, so when people become disabled, you have a better disability insurance program. Anything that's going to boost overall health in a country would boost that demographic indicator. So what we do is we develop projects that will help to improve development in places where it can be improved further. And the United Nations has actually created 2 organizations. Now remember, the UN is made up of all of the countries of the world. Most of them, I should say. And they pool money that is donated to the United Nations by the individual countries. And then some of that money is then used to support development projects around the world. Now, the first organization that was created to help with this is called the World Bank. And the World Bank the World Bank, once again, is a part of the United Nations. It's created by the United Nations. And the UN throws money into it. And members of the UN are part of the World Bank as well. And there's a head of the World Bank, for instance. And the World Bank's job is to accept development project bids from around the world that they can finance, that they can make happen. A lot of people have ideas for building development around the world, but they may not have the money to be able to build the project. So individuals or groups or corporations, right? Or maybe even a government comes to the World Bank and they pitch ideas, kind of like Shark Tank, I guess you could say. And the idea is that if the World Bank thinks that that's a worthwhile project, that it will boost development in an area, and that it's a smart way of doing so, then they will go ahead and they will approve that project, which means the World Bank funds it, essentially meaning the United Nations funds it. And again, anybody is eligible to apply for World Bank loans or grants in order to build development projects. So I had a buddy, for instance, who years ago, he and his company, his dad owned a welding company, and they welded trailers. They put those together. And they came up with a trailer that had a mobile internet station on it. And they pitched it to the World Bank so that the World Bank might fund the construction of these trailers so that they could be brought over to Africa and provide internet in places in rural Africa where internet wasn't a possibility at the time. You could come up with a plan to, I don't know, bring fresh water to an area that doesn't have it, or to build a new school, or to build a hospital, for instance. Anything that you can argue and justify as boosting development in that country, and the World Bank's going to approve some of those projects. It might reject some of them as well, because they think if it's a worthwhile project, that it can be achieved, that it's not going to be too expensive, and that the benefits of it far outweigh the costs. So that's one of the organizations created by the world, by the United Nations, to finance, to fund development projects that people come up with around the world. The second organization created is called the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. And what the IMF does, and it also is a part of the United Nations, they give emergency loans to LDC governments, to LDC economies that we are worried are on the verge of collapse. A lot of times LDCs do not have as stable an economy. So when the times are good, but when times are bad in an LDC's economy, oftentimes that situation can spiral out of control. And that can actually topple the government. It can lead to instability. It can lead to revolution or rebellion. It can even lead to war. And we don't want that. And so before an LDC government is on the verge of collapse, before their economy falls apart entirely, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, will step in and provide emergency loans to that country so that their economy can be stabilized rather than allow it to collapse. So it's a way that the countries of the world can help other countries out who are struggling economically by providing emergency loans to those countries to help them get through those tough times. All right? Together, the World Bank and the IMF receive about $50 billion every year from the United Nations, mostly from MDC governments, but also just from donations from random individuals, and donations, technically, contributions from every member of the UN. It's just that MDCs like the United States tend to contribute a lot higher percentage. Now, why do we have these lending organizations? Why can't these countries or these projects just go to the bank and get a loan? Well, LDCs really lack the money needed to finance their own development. So there's literally millions of development projects that are out there that aren't funded, that we don't have the money for. And a lot of these are located in LDCs where they could help folks the most. And they struggle to obtain funds. They struggle to get loans from banks. They struggle to get loans from other countries or grants in money. They struggle sometimes to get assistance from corporations who want to fund projects or want to build projects, but are looking for support from the government, are looking for financial assistance. And so LDCs oftentimes have all these development ideas. They just don't have the resources, the funds to necessarily make those things happen. So what happens is, if you can't go to a bank and get a loan, because let's face it, LDCs are developing, and they are not as secure, not as wealthy as most MDCs are, and so banks or other lenders oftentimes are more hesitant to give them loans. Just like a bank is more hesitant to give a lower economic class family a loan compared to a middle or an upper class one, right? Because the idea is the middle or upper class loanee is more likely to pay that back, is better able to. And so for the same reason, a lot of times developing countries struggle to get the money they need in order to develop. Now, the organizations like the World Bank and the IMF step in and they fill that void. They help those LDC countries out. All right. Now, how's the money used? Well, that money, like I said, is used to fund projects in LDCs. It can build new infrastructure. Remember, infrastructure are things like roads, railroads, bridges, right? You can build dams, not only dams that are going to prevent flooding, but also provide electric power, right? You can build electricity lines, right? An electricity network. You can build phone lines, for instance, if they don't exist. Flood protection systems, so build dams, build levees to prevent flooding from happening. You can improve the water supply, so more fresh water in an area. Maybe build more wells, right, in order to access water underground. You can build roads or hospitals or schools or similar projects that can help a country to develop according to one of those indicators. There are so many projects that could be funded. Here's the problems with international lending. I mean, obviously this sounds like an awesome idea, right? These new projects are going to create infrastructure that are going to make things more favorable for foreign companies like Starbucks to move in or McDonald's to move in. Let's face it, if we build a development project that builds roads in an LDC, right, and builds an electrical network, right, then we're kind of making improvements that are possibly going to attract foreign businesses. Banks, transnational corporations, who might be willing now to locate in that country when previously they were not able to. Hey, now they don't have to pay to build the roads. They don't have to pay to build the electrical system because it's already been built with the development project. And so that's going to cut their costs and make it easier for them to locate in this new place. That means, hey, more jobs for the workers, higher wealth levels, because oftentimes foreign companies from MDCs will come into a new location and they will offer wages that are competitive or better with the wages that already exist in that LDC for other types of work. All of this is supposed to not only attract new businesses to come to a place, it's also supposed to attract people to relocate to that place. And it's going to help the existing local businesses or the existing foreign businesses who are already there to expand and to succeed. So the goal here is spend money to build development projects that improve the lives of the people and attract more businesses and more wealth so that more development projects can then be funded by that country, which only improves development further and further and further. There's a problem. A lot of these projects that are funded by the World Bank, that are funded by the IMF, that are a part of the United Nations, are unsuccessful. So about 50% of all World Bank funded projects in Africa, for instance, have been judged failures by the United Nations. Why? Well, there's a lot of reasons. One, there is a lot of corruption in many developing country governments. And so even when development projects are funded for a government, it doesn't always mean that that project happens, that the people who are supposed to get the financing actually receive it. Sometimes corrupt officials or government leaders or business people can take that money and keep it for themselves. Also, inefficiency. With less regulations, right, with less laws and rules in place, which is the case in many developing countries, a lot of these projects are inefficient. They end up not being very successful. They end up costing more than it was originally planned, and so sometimes they're not even completed. All right, that leads us to our next reason: higher than expected costs. Look, when you get approved for a grant or a loan from the World Bank, you do estimate what the cost of the project will be, but oftentimes these estimates are lower than the cost ends up being. This is especially the case in developing countries because, let's face it, if you're having to build roads, for instance, and infrastructure in an LDC, well, what if they don't have the machinery that's necessary? Or what if they don't have the workers with the experience or the skill that's necessary? that's going to slow the process down. You're going to have to pay to bring that machinery and those workers over, or you're going to have to pay to train the local workers. That's going to take time. It's going to cost money. And so costs for these projects usually end up being a lot higher than were originally expected. And there's one more. There's oftentimes a lack of infrastructure already in these countries. So if you say, hey, we're going to build a new hospital, well, that's great. But that doesn't mean that the roads connect to the hospital. That doesn't mean that the electrical system or the phone networks do. And so ultimately, a lot of the time these projects are built, but they may not be as successful as they could be because they need to be connected to the rest of the infrastructure that's in that country. So these projects seem awesome. We need to keep doing them because they've had some incredible successes and results. But there's also a lot of failure and a lot of inefficiency that needs to be cleaned up. Otherwise, that's a lot of money, right? $25 billion potentially that is lost every year due to these failed projects. All right, so a good example of that is in the African country of Mali. There was a French-sponsored project to pump water from the Niger River using solar energy, but it only worked for a month. And even when it worked, the project, which cost more than $1 million to build, didn't produce about as much fresh water as 2 gasoline-powered pumps that together cost about $6,000. So we build this really elaborate solar-powered water pump in Africa, right? Seems like a great idea, seems very green, very environmentally friendly. It didn't work for a long period of time, and then when it did, it was only pumping the same amount of water that 2 gas-powered pumps that would have only cost $6,000 did. So again, it's a perfect example of kind of the inefficiency and some of the issues we have with development. Now, that doesn't mean we should stop these development programs. It definitely means we need to improve them and make them more successful. And then here's another good example. In Tanzania, we had a $165 million project that the World Bank funded to improve water supply, more clean water, right? So a sanitation system as well. The problem is they failed to improve the supply of water. Even after we spent $165 million on this, it still didn't really improve how much water was coming into this area. It was supposed to replace aged infrastructure, right? Water supply pipes, pumps, sewer systems, and to introduce meters that, would measure the amount of usage so people could be billed. This was supposed to be done in a city with over 4 million people. It took over 7 years to implement, and most of the pipes were already substandard by the time that the project was complete, which meant that they needed to be replaced, and the meters never actually even worked. All right, so a lot of money spent, incredible results in certain areas of development, especially, for instance, with women's education, right? Overall health around the world, but also a lot of issues with development. And it has caused a lot of people, right, to maybe question whether these development projects are worthwhile or whether that money could be spent more efficiently. However, since the UN and the World Bank and IMF have had a lot of successes, we definitely are going to see those continue into the future. Let's move it on at this point over to the next set of slides. And now these are the development theories and model slides. And I want to point out to you again, you complete this Google chart and submit it back to me as an assignment as you are watching this video/slides as you go through these materials. I also want to mention one other thing. Richard Nolan's stages of growth, we're not covering that, all right? We're saving that for later in the year for a different unit. So we're only going to cover these first few slides, but these are really important topics, and so therefore you're going to be filling in the information for each of them here, right? We're going to cross out Nolan's stages of growth. I'm not covering it. And then, based on these descriptions below, on the second page of the assignment, you'll be indicating which of the models is being described in each of these examples, all right? I'll tell you right now, number 5 here is Nolan's stages of growth, so we're going to cut that baby out, all right? All right, let's get to it, and that means we're going to go in the order that they ought to appear here on the PowerPoint, and that means we start with Rostow. W. Rostow, all right? Walt Whitman Rostow is a really famous economic geographer. He developed a model as to how every country in the world would advance or develop. It was developed in 1960. What he did was he studied Europe and the United States, and he kind of assumed every country would develop in the same way that Europe and the United States had. And he studied U.S. development. He studied European development. And he looked to see if there were stages or a pattern as to how those places developed. And what he came up with was this 5-stage model. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, you'll notice that the stages are almost like stairs, right? Climbing upwards. And that's exactly what Rostow's model says. It says that every country starts in stage 1, and every country over time moves up to stage 5. Now, he says the most developed countries in the world are already in stage 5. That's the maximum level of development. But other countries in the world are on their way up still. So some of them are in stage 2, some of them are in stage 3, some of them are in stage 4, and of course the most developed are in stage 5. So he says every country is going to get to stage 5 at some point, right? It just takes different times for each country to develop. And he says the key to development is industrialization. When you have that industrial revolution, he says, that's the key. That's the step that starts to get you to move up to 2 and eventually to 3, 4, and then stage 5. All right, now let's go through these steps. Like I mentioned, countries progress at their own pace. And he argued it's really rare for a country to go back down again. So once you've achieved a stage, it's pretty much impossible for you to drop back down. Now, he also says, coming back here, MDCs are either stage 4 or stage 5. Most of them are stage 5 at this point. And he says LDCs, developing countries, tend to be stage 2 or stage 3. He says there's no country left in stage 1. Everybody has gotten out of that. There may be some areas in some countries that are stage 1, but every country as a whole has at least advanced to stage 2 of the demographic transit, I should say, of the Rostow model. All right, so 2 and 3 LDCs, 4 and 5, we're getting into MDC territory. Okay, stage 1. Step 1, traditional society. He says, hey, in a stage 1 country, right, most people, there is no industrialization at all. There has been no industrial revolution. Everything is made by hand. Tools are very primitive, right? We have no iron or steel or any of those things. Most people are farmers, right, or hunters and gatherers. They do not have manufacturing at all. If anything is made, it is made completely by hand for your own purpose, not for sale. There's no such thing as mass production. If there is trade going on in that society, it's mostly crops. And basically what he's describing, folks, to be honest, are almost like hunter and gatherers, almost like traditional native societies, where it's growing crops, it's hunting, it's gathering. If there is trading happening, it's handmade goods that are being traded between tribes or groups. Now, there's no country in the world that is still at that stage. Every country has industrialized at least in some way. So he argues everybody is in stage 2 at our time, although in the past, every country started as a stage 1. All right? So stage 2 is called preconditions for takeoff. So it's our second step of this model, but it's in a lot of ways, think of like a plane taking off. In stage 1, the plane is really just kind of parked in the terminal. In stage 2, this industrialization development plane is now taxiing to the runway. It's getting in position to take off. And he says, hey, Rostow, you know, you have to build transportation systems. You need roads. You need communication systems in place. You need other systems put into place to allow industries to start to appear and to start to grow and develop. And so what he says is you kind of need individuals or an individual who really is going to be responsible for building up the infrastructure to allow industrialization to take place. New ideas and inventions are going to start to emerge, and for the first time we're going to start to see some greater wealth in this country And more importantly, we've built the base, we've built the platform by which development can occur. Again, there are some countries in stage 2 where we're seeing some early industrialization, but it's mostly in transportation, right? Like roads, railroads, things like that. Or maybe communication, where you start to see your basic communication devices like a telegraph emerge, or a telephone in more modern times. Stage 3 is when industrialization really happens. That's when we start to produce goods with machines on a larger scale. All right, no more are we producing things by hand. Now we are in the takeoff stage. Now our plane of development has officially taken off and is gaining altitude. And you start to see certain industries just boom. And they boom because machines are invented that massively boost production. When production is boosted, the price of goods tends to come down. So suddenly we have way more goods at a much cheaper rate than we did when we were making them by hand. Now, the thing is, in stage 3, it's only certain industries that experience this. So for instance, if you know anything about the U.S. Industrial Revolution, it started in textiles, it started in clothing, and then slowly over time it spread to railroads and other areas until every industry in the country was industrialized. So stage 3, the takeoff, you're only going to see industrialization in certain key industries that are almost going to be like a spark that sparks these other industries later on to industrialize and to be mass produce as well. Once you have started industrialization in the takeoff stage, once you're starting to see certain industries begin to boom, then eventually you will advance into the drive to maturity stage 4. This is when the technology that is available gets better, it gets enhanced, the machines that you've already developed become even stronger and better than before, and you start to develop new technology in industries that never had it before. So now it's not just a few industries that are industrialized in your country. Now all production is starting to become more industrialized. So now you're going to see it spread from the textiles and from the transportation to oil and iron and steel and other forms of machinery, right? And so now this industrialization is happening all over the country, and it's happening in a number of different industries as well. Finally, stage 5, he says, is the highest, most developed stage that a country can be. That is when you are a mass consumption economy. He says eventually over time, when you're in stage 4 for long enough, you start to develop enough wealth where you can invest in schools, education, people start to live longer, and suddenly you start to develop a more highly skilled workforce. That means more higher wages for those skilled workers. And this is when you start to see more folks begin to move into tertiary jobs. So out of secondary, but into tertiary. And most of the industry that is still producing goods isn't producing heavy machinery and iron and steel as much. It's producing consumer goods that people buy on a daily basis. And so you're really providing a lot of different consumer goods at a very high level, usually more expensive products, right, that a higher skilled, higher wage force is able to afford. So again, these are the 5 stages of Rostow. And stage 1 to stage 5, you need to know each of these stages by name. And you need to kind of be able to describe them in a little bit of detail as well. This is by far the most famous of the development models, and it's the one that's been on the AP exam the most. And you definitely need to know the details of this one. All right? Now, hey, some criticisms of Rostow. 1, he based it on European and North American countries, and capitalist countries at that. And he didn't really take into account other regions of the world or the possibility that there could be other systems that would allow a country to develop instead. All right? 2, Rostow's model made sense when we looked at Europe and the United States and how they industrialized. But it doesn't really explain more recent countries that have industrialized, because it seems like some of these more recent countries may have skipped a step. All right, for instance, a lot of Southeast Asian countries seem like they went from stage 3 to stage 5 without ever achieving stage 4, for instance. That's a flaw in his system that he never really accounted for. So again, kind of culturally biased to the Western Hemisphere, right? And really biased towards one system, capitalism, and definitely doesn't explain kind of things that have happened in modern times as well, related to how some LDCs have developed. All right. Again, that is the Rostow model. Let's go to our second competing model, and this is called the world systems model. Our second theory, world systems theory, is developed by a guy named Emanuel Wallerstein. Now, Wallerstein was a socialist geographer. So Wallerstein had a lot of issues with Rostow and felt that Rostow was way too positive and optimistic. Because Rostow said, hey, every country is going to get to stage 5. It's just going to take some a lot longer than others. Like, for instance, the United States, he said, well, we went into stage 2 in 1800, and then stage 3, we were there by the late 1800s, and stage 4 right around the 1940s, right after World War II. And then by the 60s or 70s, we've made it to stage 5. So that's a couple 100-year process, right? But he said everybody's going to get there, and that's why certain countries in Africa are down here, but hey, they'll eventually get to stage 5 as well. Well, Wallerstein had a real issue with that. He thought it was way too optimistic, and it kind of, he argued, glorified or glossed over some of the issues that certain countries have around the world. And of course, Wallerstein blamed capitalism. All right? And so Wallerstein argued that the world was actually not as, I don't know, what do we want to do? Cooperative. All right? The world was not as rosy a place. He argued, hey, there are definitely countries that are advanced and developed in the world. But they had gotten that way because they had really taken advantage of the rest of the world in some way in order to get to that status. So he argued, hey, we could take every country and we can divide it into 3 groups. We could divide it into the core regions of the world. Those are the most developed. And those generally are the developed capitalist economies of the world. Then he argued there are the least developed countries, and those are what he called the peripheral countries, or the periphery. They were often impoverished. They're often poor. They're very dependent on core countries for business, for money, for loans. And then he argued there are countries in the middle that he described as semi-peripheral. And they had both core and peripheral activities occurring within them at the same time. And what he argued, Wallerstein, was essentially, and by the way, this is a map of his theory. The blue areas on this are the core regions of the world. The green are the semi-peripheral areas, and then the yellow would be the peripheral parts. And what Wallerstein argued was, hey, the core has gotten rich by exploiting and using the resources of the periphery throughout history. So they would go into Africa or into South America, and they would extract the natural resources, and they would bring those back to Europe or North America or Australia or Japan, and they would then use those to gain wealth, to grow rich, and to grow powerful. But they had done so by taking advantage of the resources of other places. And he argued that has left these developing places, these least developed areas of the world, completely impoverished and completely dependent on the core countries then and now. Because a lot of the natural resources that are left in the world today are still in these peripheral areas, but the governments of these countries are unable to extract them on their own. They don't have the resources. They don't have the infrastructure. And so oftentimes they have to let core companies come in order to extract the resources that are located there. For instance, Central Africa has a lot of diamonds and other minerals, right? But a lot of the governments there aren't able to really extract those minerals on their own because they don't have the technology to do so. And so they hire or they allow businesses from the U.S. or from Europe to come in and to extract those resources. And a lot of those resources, even today, continue to be sent back to the core areas. So the core have gotten rich thanks to the periphery. And they are determined, the core, to kind of keep those countries in the periphery, Wallerstein says, because they need to continue this relationship of keeping those places dependent on the core. And then he argues, hey, there's also these countries in the middle, like China, like Brazil, hey, like Mexico, like an area in Southeast Asia of Vietnam and the Philippines that we call the Four Tigers. And what they've done is, even while they're being taken advantage of and exploited by the core, they're turning around and doing the same thing to other developing places, to the poorest parts of the world. So, for instance, China is investing heavily in Africa. They're building businesses. Chinese corporations are building infrastructure. They're setting up business deals in Africa so that the wealth in Africa, the resources, can be brought back to the Chinese people and to those Chinese businessmen. While that's going on in China and Africa, the same thing is happening with U.S. companies doing the same thing to China. All right, U.S. companies are also doing the same thing to Africa. So do you see how it's kind of a revolving door? The core are getting really, really, really wealthy and developed thanks to the resources around the rest of the world. The people in the poorest places are really kind of being dependent and taking advantage of. And then those in the middle, the green areas, are being taken advantage of by the core, while they turn around and do the same thing to the yellow regions themselves. All this leads to is a system, a three-tiered system of dependence, with the haves at the top, the have-nots at the bottom, and then a group of countries that are really preying on the poorest parts of the world in the middle. All right? And by the way, again, this is the Wallerstein map. This is a view of an azimuthal map that's created that shows where the core regions are, right, that are really doing all of this exploitation according to this theory. All right, so Rostow and Wallerstein are opposites. Rostow really talks about the benefits of capitalism, that everybody's going to get to a period of incredible development, whereas Wallerstein points out, no, that system actually has led to high, middle, and low, and that system is continuing to exploit those in the middle and at the bottom as well. All right, a couple of quick other theories out here. Core periphery. Remember, the core is a center area of activity. The periphery is further away. And so what this theory argues is that there are certain, that regions or countries or cities can actually be divided into a core periphery setup. And what this theory argues is every country or every region of the world, they have an industrial core area. That's an area where almost all of the manufacturing is taking place. There's lots of urban cities, there's lots of people there, there's a lot of workers, there's a lot of markets, which means a lot of buyers, because there's so many people clustered in one area. And that's where factories cluster. For us in the United States, that would be like the Northeast, New York, the areas along the East Coast. Then, what this model argues is that there will be an area in a country that is an upward transition area that's gaining jobs, that's attracting more industry. And people are tending to move there from the industrial core because there's so many new jobs and new factories that are opening up there. Because of all this growth in that area, that's where a lot of new tax money is being generated, and services are a lot better, are much improved. This theory also argues that there is going to be a downward transition area somewhere in a country. That's a place that's losing jobs, that's losing businesses. A lot of them are relocating to this upward transition area. So as this upward transition modernizes and becomes more popular with people, other parts of the country lose people and lose businesses that relocate to the upward zone. And that means less tax money in these areas. That means fewer services are provided. And so this is kind of a deteriorating part of a country, whereas the upward transition is kind of the place that's experiencing all the positives. And then finally, what this theory argued is there's a resource frontier. That's a place that's removed from the industrial core, that's further away, but it's where most of the resources are provided. And those resources get shipped or sent to the other areas to allow for industrialization to take place. Transportation systems are set up that actually move those resources to the industrial areas. So, using the U.S. as an example, right, the East Coast would be our industrial core. That's where most of the big businesses and big and largest cities are located. Upward transition would be the Sun Belt, the southern part of the United States, which is experiencing a lot of growth in people, and that would include Southern California, all the way down through Texas and down through Florida, the southern parts of the U.S. The downward transition area would kind of be like the area around the Great Lakes, right? Around like Michigan and Pennsylvania, which have lost a lot of factories who have relocated down south. And then the resource frontier would be out west all the way up to like Alaska, where we get most of our oil and other minerals that are then shipped or pipelined back over to the continental U.S. to be used for industrial purposes. So it's kind of a generic model. You could create a core periphery model for Anaheim. You could create a core periphery model for California. You could create a core periphery model for the western United States. You could create a core periphery model for the entire country. So again, it's a generic model that can be applied to any region, country, city, or area, and they would ask you to try to identify those 4 sub-regions within that area. Last one, dependency theory. It's also known as neocolonialism, all right? It's the idea that leaders, political leaders, business leaders, and LDCs actually want to keep their developing countries poor and less developed for as long as possible. They actually want to guarantee that those countries remain poor and dependent on the rest of the world. Why? Well, if their country stays in LDC, then that means that they are eligible for a lot of assistance from the World Bank and from the IMF. They get a lot more resources and aid from the United Nations. And then they, the leaders in this country, can take that assistance, right, and they can possibly use some of it to make themselves wealthy and to hoard resources for themselves, even while the rest of the country remains very poor and in debt. This is also another theory developed by socialist geographers. So, for instance, North Korea has a dictator, right, Kim Jong-un, and they receive a lot of assistance from countries like China, and he lives an incredibly extravagant, rich life because he keeps a lot of those resources for himself, his family, and his supporters, even while the rest of the country is battling with famine and starvation and a lack of electricity and other basic needs. The same thing happens in the country of Ukraine. It led to a rebellion there not long ago because the people were dissatisfied that their leadership had so much wealth and power compared to the rest of society. It happened in Libya and other countries in North Africa because leaders there were, well, living such an extravagant life that the people finally had enough of this and tried to overthrow the government. Good example, again, is North Korea. Look at these palaces that exist in North Korea. Pianos, right? Just incredibly extravagant ballrooms, just glorious. Meanwhile, right, this is the country of North Korea. This is North Korea at night. They don't have any electricity, so the entire country looks dark. It looks like an ocean. People get about 30 minutes of electricity a day, according to the studies that we have seen. And so the leaders there, right, this family, they have an interest in keeping the country poor because it guarantees they're going to be receiving outside aid, outside assistance, which they can then use for their own purposes. All right? A very pessimistic view of development. Same as world systems theory. Not nearly as optimistic, for instance, as Rostow's model. Now, hey, folks, last thing. This Richard Nolan stages of growth we're going to save for the industrialization part. All right? The industrial geography unit. So we're going to skip over that for now. So when you get to this box with Nolan stages of growth, just leave it blank. All right, and when you get to the example down here for number 5, just go ahead and type in Nolan stages of growth. I'm going to give that one to you. And then for each of the other 4, 1 through 4, try to tell me which development model is being described in each. All right, Mr. M signing out. Let me know if you have any questions. Have a great one. My e-learning